Hello friends, this is Victor Mecwan. I have been a former additional CEO for the Gujarat State Disaster Management Authority and have been dealing with the disaster management. I intend to see that the disaster management is taken up by several people. There is a lot of inquisitiveness about how the disasters are dealt by the government and at the national, at the state level, the district level, and so on and so forth. And that's why we are coming up with a new series in Knowledge Bites about the disaster management. I hope you like it. So, today I'm going to take the first part on the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction 2015 to 2030. Before we start and going ahead for the disaster risk reduction and what is disaster management, let's first understand the 30 years of disaster risk reduction. In the pre-1970s, there was a totally ad hoc disaster response, and government used to react to the disasters by simply providing basic emergency relief, search and rescue, and basic assistance. Long-term impact was ignored by the governments. However, thereafter, especially during the decade of 1990 to 1999, the UN agencies started looking into the disaster management and to promote the international coordinated efforts to reduce material losses and economic disruption caused by natural disaster, especially in developing countries. On December 11, 1987, the UN General Assembly through resolutions declared 1990 as the International Decade for Natural Disasters. The International Day 13th of October for disaster risk reduction was started in 1989 after a call by UNGA, UN General Assembly, for a day to promote global culture of risk awareness and disaster reduction to be held each year. In this continuation, the first World Conference on Natural Disaster was held in Yokohama, Japan from 23rd to 27th of May 1994, which was adopted by the name Yokohama Strategy for a Safer World. Guidelines for natural disaster prevention, preparedness and mitigation, and its plan of action endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 1994. The International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction was adopted during the IDNDR Program Forum held in Geneva in 1999, which was ratified by the United Nations Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly. Thereafter, in the year 2005, YOGO Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was a global blueprint for the disaster risk reduction efforts with a 10-year plan adopted in January 2005 by 168 member states of the UN at the World Conference on Disaster Reduction. This was held in Kobe, Miyagi, Japan. Priorities of this particular part included disaster risk reduction, identification, assessment through legal and policy framework, disaster preparedness, and use of innovation was adopted. The World Conference has been convened 3 times in Japan by the UN to give a structured response to the disaster management. The first conference was held in Yokohama in 1994. The second conference was held in Yogo in 2005, and the third conference, the Sendai, held in 2015. Japan has always been a leader in the field of disaster management. UN promoted a DM cycle, that is a disaster management cycle, so that it could be a continuous and proactive approach to deal with the disaster management. Let's understand the UN Development Agenda. At the beginning of the new millennium in 2000, world leaders gathered at the UN to shape a broad vision to fight poverty in its many dimensions. That vision was translated into 8 Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals framework has guided developmental work across the world for 15 years, that is from 2000 to 2015. The goals include eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, and ensure environmental sustainability and a global partnership for development. According to the World Bank, About 9.2% of the world, or 719 million people, live in extreme poverty or less than $2.15 per day as of January 2021, and say around 71.9 crores of people are poor. The poverty rate was 11.3%, or about 31.1 million people were poor in 2000. So that's how looking to the poor and how to eradicate the poverty, this particular Millennium Development Goals were framed and were acted upon. Now let's go to the introduction to the SFDRR, that is Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Post 2015, that is just after the Millennium Development Goals, an agenda was set forth in three landmark global agreements. The first is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction at Sendai in Japan in March 2015. Second was the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN General Assembly in New York in September 2015. And third is the Climate Change Agreement, the Conference of Parties, COP21 at Paris in December 2015. These have set the stage for global action on DRR, that is disaster risk reduction, sustainable development and climate change. Now we go to the next part. These agreements have created a shift from the approach from managing disasters to managing risk. As I told you previously that in the pre-1970s, the government used to take the disasters and just manage the disaster as and when it came, and there was no long-term vision attached to it. However, these agreements have created a shift from the managing disaster to managing risk. India is committed to all these global frameworks and various measures for the realization of goals through involvement of government, private sector and the NGOs. The forward to the Sendai framework describes it as a successor instrument to the Yogo framework for actions, building resilience of nations and communities to disasters. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction marks a definitive shift globally towards the comprehensive disaster risk management aimed at disaster risk reduction and increasing disaster resilience. The goal is now DRR as the expected outcome, preventing creation of new risks, reducing the existing ones, and strengthening the overall disaster resilience. SFDRR is a non-binding agreement. The signatory nations, including India, will attempt to comply on voluntary basis. The framework aims to achieve globally over a period of 15 years by 2030 substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in the lives, livelihoods and health in the economic, physical, social, cultural and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities and countries. So let's first understand the priorities of the actions under the SFDRR. There are four priorities for action under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Priority 1 is understanding the disaster risk. Unless you understand the disaster risk which is attached to it, it is very difficult for anything to go ahead. So first, the priority 1 says understanding the disaster risk. So in which policies and practices for DRR should be based on an understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of persons and assets, hazard characteristics and the environment. Priority 2 consists of strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Disaster risk governance at the national, regional and global level is of great importance for an effective and efficient management of disaster risk. Priority 3 includes investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Public and private investments in DRR are essential to enhance the economic, social, health and cultural resilience of persons, communities, countries, their assets as well as environment. Priority 4 includes enhancing disaster risk preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Strengthened disaster preparedness for response, recovery, rehabilitation and reconstructions are critical to build back better. Like the 4 priorities of action, there are also 7 global targets. to deal with the disaster risk reduction. First is to reduce the mortality, which means zero death approach, lower loss of life, to take preventive and mitigative measures through NDRF, SDRF, Abda Mitra, and likewise. The second is affected people. So here it means to bring down this number wherein the socio-economic impact is least of these kind of disasters which happen at any point of time anywhere across the country. The third is economic loss. The point is to reduce the economic loss in any disaster, be it earthquake, cyclone, or tsunami, or any other chemical disasters, or any other disaster per se. The fourth is to damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of the basic services, which is a basic critical infrastructure, so that we see that during the disasters, the roads, telephone lines, bridges, airports, buildings, seaports, power plants, power grids, etc. These are critical infrastructures, and their damages have to be curtailed to a big extent, and see that once the disaster happens thereafter, these things are taken back across and put in a normal conditions at the earliest possible. Now, apart from reducing these mortality, affected people, economic loss, and damage to the critical infrastructure, the others are increasing of the countries with the national and local DRR strategies. Unless you have a very clear-cut strategy, it is very difficult to go ahead as to how to deal with the disasters. So every country per se, every state, every district, and at the last level, at the village level, there has to be a strategy as to how to deal with any disaster which is there. So that is why we need to adopt a disaster risk reduction strategy. In the SAARC region center at GIDM in Gandhinagar, there has been a South Asian Association of Regional Conferences, and DM Center is at place at DIGM, and which increases the capacity building of the member countries along with the sharing experiences and best practices. G20, India's presidency's first disaster risk reduction working group meeting was held in Gandhinagar from 30th March to 1st of April in 2023. So it deliberated on global coverage of early warning system, disaster resilient infrastructure, stronger national financial frameworks, disaster response systems, and increased application of ecosystems based approaches to the DRR. The next is the availability and access to the multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information assessments. India is a regional leader in the disaster management, and we have the National Disasters Management Authority, National Disaster Management Plan of 2019, which is based on the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. The plan is based on 4 priority themes of the Sendai framework. The plan is a regional approach to SDMA, that is State Disaster Management Authorities, and the District Management Authorities, which is not only helpful for the disaster management but also for developmental planning. Now let's move also about the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Goals were adopted by the UN General Assembly at New York on 25th of September 2015. There are 17 global goals and 169 targets, which are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all the people enjoy peace and prosperity. SDGs are built on the successes of the Millennium Development Goals, including new areas like economic inequality, innovation, sustainable consumption, peace and justice, and others, while tackling climate change, working to preserve our oceans and forests. So we see here the 17 different sustainable goals. That is, first is no poverty, then zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, Seventh is affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure. 10th is reduced inequalities. 11th, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land. 16th is peace, justice and strong institutions, and 17th is partnerships for the goals. There are three dimensions of these sustainable development goals. For sustainable development to be achieved, it is very crucial to harmonize the three core elements, that is the economic growth, social inclusion and environmental protection. Another way to look at the SDGs, that is Sustainable Development Goals, are 5 Ps. The 5 Ps include people, that is end poverty and hunger in all forms and ensure dignity and equality. The next one is prosperity, that is ensure prosperous and fulfilling lives in harmony with nature. Peace, foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies wherein every part and every class, creed, age, gender is a part of the inclusive society. Partnership among the different people, communities, countries, so that the sustainable development goals can be achieved faster. And the planet, to protect our planet's natural resources and climate for future generations. These 5 Ps highlight how the SDGs are an intertwined framework instead of a group of siloed goals. Progress of one P must balance and support the another. The focus on people. Now, the point number 1 is no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education and gender equality. These are the 5 goals which focuses on the people, so that every person on earth has a good amount of food, there is no poverty, there is a good health and well-being, there is a quality education for each one, and there is also a gender equality. The focus on the planet and the prosperity, so that is clean water and sanitation, which is for each and everyone, affordable and clean energy for each one, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, required reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water and life on land. So these are all points which covers and where the focus is on the planet and the prosperity of the people on the planet. The point number 16 regarding the peace, justice and strong institutions is the focus is on the peace, and 17 is the partnership among, as I said, from the state level, district level, national level, regional level and the world among the countries. Now the vision is set out in the SDGs for people, planet and prosperity and peace. The pledge is that no one will be left behind requires a specific focus on the poorest of the poor and most vulnerable people across the world. The key challenge is up to 325 million extremely poor people are likely to be living in the 49 most hazard-prone countries by 2030. Now let's go about the coherence of the mutual reinforcement of the SDGs and the Sendai framework. On the left, you can see the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction is there. Where are the targets? 7 targets are there. Number of deaths which have to be reduced. Direct disaster economic loss which has to be reduced. Then direct disaster economic loss in relation to global GDP, including disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. Those have to be reduced. Similarly, number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies have to be taken up. So we have to adopt a local strategy. And the last is proportion of local government that adopt and implement local disaster risk reduction strategies in line with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So they are in terms related to our sustainable development goals. In target 1.5 in no poverty. In 11 it is sustainable cities and communities, and of course the climate action, which we are dealing with the several disasters. So that's how they are all interlinked. So while working for the one under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction or under the sustainable development goal, each are complementing each other, and that's how the things are very coherent and they are reinforced under one umbrella. So thank you very much for patiently hearing me. Thank you.